Welcome back, everybody, to our concluding session. We're grateful for your stamina, your fortitude. We promise you a concluding, very stimulating session with our panelists. But before we proceed, I would like to welcome our next elected official up to the podium to deliver some remarks. Since 2022, Mark Levine has been Manhattan Borough President. During his 8 years in the New York City Council, he represented Upper Manhattan, where he championed tenants' rights, public health, and equity in schools, transit, parks, and housing. Borough President Levine has called upon the federal government to financially support New York City as it deals with an influx of migrants who are desperate for food, clothing, and shelter. And as someone who's got his ear to the ground, we're extremely grateful for him being here today and delivering some reflections on the political ramifications of the history we've been talking about all day. So, Mark. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your day to dive in deep on this important topic. I don't think academics are renowned for being sports fanatics, but if you have a little bit of withdrawal because you're missing the NAACP women's basketball final, I can tell you a live score. South Carolina's up over Iowa 57-53. Apparently, Caitlin Clark had an 18-point spree in the first quarter, so a lot to catch up on when you finish today. It has been quite inspiring to see your focus today going through the past century of immigration history here as it's played out in our public policy in New York City and nationally as you mark the 100th anniversary of the Johnson-Reed Act. I want to tell you that many of the themes you have been exploring today are playing out right now in New York City, as we are now well over a year and a half into a major wave of arrivals of asylum seekers. I guess as historians, you probably put this into context, and 180,000 is the most recent number that I have for the measure of this total wave, and that's not much compared to big years in the early 1900s. But there are important ways in which it's different this time, which I'll talk about. I've had the pleasure to interact a great deal with the families that are arriving here, including being there to receive buses at the Port Authority. I've been to many of the sites where we are providing shelter to migrant, both single adults and families. We now are providing accommodation to about 65,000 migrants, which is a very large number. It exceeds the entire capacity of New York City's homeless shelter system, which is in the mid-50,000. So this is a big number for us. But also interesting to compare that to the number of total arrivals, which I mentioned was 180,000. That means that almost 2 out of 3 of those who have arrived to New York City have made their way beyond the shelter system. Some of them have moved on to other cities, but many of them have been able to find accommodation here and even been able to find employment here. And speaking to so many of them, whether it's been one-on-one greeting buses, or we've done a number of events for the arrivals where we've helped them orient to the legal landscape and understand how they can access social services. We have done those events in Spanish. We have also increasingly been doing those events in French. I think this may be underappreciated. Yes, the majority still are arriving from Latin America, but increasingly from other parts of the world, particularly Francophone Northwest Africa. I would estimate at this point probably 20 to 25% of the arrivals are Francophone, for reasons that are not entirely clear to me, particularly from Mauritania, but other French-speaking countries in Africa. And so we decided to do a whole session in French to help orient these arrivals. What I have found consistently, speaking over the last year and a half to Spanish speakers, I do speak Spanish, and to French speakers, the first question I'm asked is, how can I work? This is what the migrants want to know. They are absolutely determined to pay taxes, to pay their own rent, to make a positive contribution to the city, and by God, we need them. We need this infusion of workers for our economy. But there are real barriers right now. And really the most consistent demand that I and so many others have made on the federal government is expedite granting of work permits. And I think you probably know this, but asylum seekers are not undocumented immigrants. They are pursuing a legal path, and they are eligible to request work permits. But federal rules and federal resource constraints have severely slowed down that process so that it can take years to get work permits. And in the meantime, families here who want to work are left with no good options. We had a partial victory in the granting of TPS, temporary protective status, for arrivals from just Venezuela, the single largest group, so don't want to minimize that, but it's probably no more than a third of the migrants here at this point. And we're continuing to fight to get other groups expedited status to get work permits, and for many who are working their way through the asylum system, it's a matter of securing them legal assistance and helping them fill out the paperwork. And I think New York City was a little late to move aggressively on that, but is now catching up and making progress on that for sure. On the whole, I am actually very proud that New York City has opened its arms. Most New Yorkers have seen this as part of our tradition, have seen this as a net positive for the city. New Yorkers and even city government with some challenges, some of which I push back on, and with some backlash, which is all too familiar to you as people who have studied the last 100 years of immigration. We have seen some very ugly forms of backlash. Some of it is tying into this existing narrative about crime in New York City, with forces on the right who have attempted to blow up individual cases of crimes which it appears that migrants were involved in, and those are reprehensible for sure, but they do not reflect the broad intentions of the 180,000 who have arrived here. And frankly, what you've seen reported about some of these incidents has been wildly inaccurate. You know, there was a case a few weeks ago of a reprehensible attack on some police officers in Times Square by a group of migrants, in which it was reported that they were all immediately released, that there has never been any arrests, that 4 of them fled without impediment on a bus to California, and really none of that is true. There have been a number of arrests, and those individuals are now in custody. Bail has been applied. It was a false report that 4 of them fled to California on a bus. So shout out to our district attorney, Alvin Bragg, who took a lot of heat for that episode and did the right thing, and in the end is doing good work on this case and so much else. Was there a support for Alvin Bragg in the back? Is that what I heard? Okay, good. Wow. Thumbs up from the historians of New York City for Alvin Bragg. He is really doing great by us. I have to observe, I don't know if I'm allowed to be political, so I'll be careful here, but I am a politician. I have to observe that last week, the New York Republican Party did its annual gala, and they did it in Manhattan, in Midtown, and their headlining honoree was a certain governor, I would argue the most xenophobic governor in America, by the name of Greg Abbott. And I am so sick of these Republicans in New York who have just been beating up on the arrival of the buses of migrants. And the hypocrisy then of honoring Greg Abbott, it's really disgusting. And Governor Abbott's behavior has been disgusting as well. But I fear I've veered too far into partisan territory. I got an applause from that. Thank you. Thank you from that. Okay, good. I like this room. I got to hang out with you more. This wave of migrants has been, I think, different from some of those you have studied in decades past, because we have a right to shelter law in New York City now. and we didn't during the early parts of the 20th century. And that law has been incredibly good for New York. It's why you don't see the number of homeless people on the street that you see on the West Coast, for example, where you have whole tent cities because they don't have a right to shelter, and we have it here. It's been very, very important for New York City since the 80s when it was put into effect via court order. But it's also created a burden for us as we have been required to provide shelter to arrivals, and I'm proud that the city has done that, but it has been hard. It's been hard to find accommodation for 65,000 people. It's been expensive, and it's why I and many others have demanded that the federal government help to fund this response. Though it is true that in the short term, these families have enormous needs of shelter and food and medical care and schools, I believe with every fiber of my being that this wave of arrivals is going to be good for New York City, just as every other wave of arrivals has been. And what I need from you as historians, with people who have credibility, who have a platform, I need you to tell the story of the last 100 years in the context of today. I need you to tell people that while it's hard, immigration is hard. Immigration can be politically hard. And it's hard for migrants to arrive here with nothing. And this wave is arriving with nothing. Again and again and again. It has infused New York City with energy and dynamism. It has been good for the economy of New York City. It has been good for the schools of New York City. We're down 200,000 students in the New York City public school system over the last decade or so. It's great that we have now probably 20,000 kids, migrant kids in our schools. And they need help now. They need not just bilingual staff, they need counseling after the trauma that they've been through on the way here. But it is good for New York City that they are here. So thank you to all of you who are using the stories of history to make that case today. And thank you for this conference and for including me. Enjoy the rest. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.
So I would like to welcome up the panelists for session number 5, and I'll turn the mic over to Rachel Cranston, who will be the moderator.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? I'm Rachel Cranston. I am the Director of Jewish Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. And you all, we've made it. We've made it to the present day, to 2024. I don't know that we're happy to be here, but we made it. And that's what we're going to be discussing today in this panel. So this panel is going to focus on the controversies and challenges and opportunities surrounding immigration today. And in particular, we're going to think a bit about how the anti-immigrant ideologies that circulated 100 years ago evolved, and in some ways continue to resonate today and to bleed into current myths and conspiracy theories around immigration that have had devastating effects on present-day migrants and also native-born American Jews. We have 2 renowned panelists here speaking to us about this issue. First, in alphabetical order, is my colleague at the University of Pittsburgh, Kathleen Blee, a distinguished professor in the Department of Sociology, who is a leading expert on white supremacist extremism. She's written many books on the topic and just came out with a new one entitled Out of Hiding: Extremist White Supremacism and How It Can Be Stopped. And we also have Mark Hetfield, the president and CEO of the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, HIAS, one of the most impactful and venerable Jewish organizations and immigrant support organizations operating in the US for well over a century. Before we get started, let me just reiterate that what you have before you are 2 representatives of Pittsburgh and 1 of HIAS. which means that everyone here on the panel, myself included, has been haunted, relentlessly haunted by the the synagogue shooting that took place in Pittsburgh in 2018. The murderer, as we know, was radicalized by the notion that American Jews were bringing immigrants into the United States to replace and attack native-born white people, and chose to target a synagogue that had proudly signed on to sponsor a refugee and immigrant Shabbat, an initiative organized by HIAS. So that is certainly part of what we're going to be working through today as we think about how the anti-immigrant ideologies of a century ago, again, have evolved, have changed, but also continue to plague us in our own time. And with that, let me kick off the discussion with our first question that I will first address to Mark, which is, how do the anti-immigration myths and ideologies that led to the Johnson-Reed Act and the many other immigration restrictions that we've talked about over the course of this symposium today, how do they continue to resonate in American society today? And how might some of them be different, have evolved differently, and look differently than they looked 100 years ago?
So Rachel, if you'd asked me that question for the 90th anniversary of the Johnson-Reed Act, my answer would have been very different. I've been doing this work for a long time. I've started working for HIAS in 1989 as a caseworker in Rome. So by 2014, I'd already been working in this field for 25 years. And at that time, I would have said, Johnson-Reed is history. We have learned from it. We're ashamed of it. We've moved past it. We would never do anything like that again in this country. If you asked me that question in 2015, I would have said, we are living in the same era as Johnson-Reed. I will never forget the attacks in Paris on November 13th, 2015. Not just the attacks themselves, the terrorist attacks in Paris, but the response in this country to those attacks, where you had 31 governors come out in rapid succession, one after the other, 30 of whom were Republicans, one of whom was a Democrat, who actually said that we need to stop Syrian Muslim refugees from coming to the United States, and that they would make sure that Syrian Muslim refugees would not be allowed to be resettled in their states. I couldn't believe I was hearing elected officials at the statewide level saying they're not going to allow people into their states because of their religion or because of where they were born, or really a combination of the two. You know, it really was the 1920s all over again, and I wish it had stopped there, but it hasn't stopped ever since that time. It just keeps going on and on. You then had 14 Republican presidential candidates for the nomination at that same time, and they all echoed the words of those 31 governors, saying we need to pause Syrian Muslim refugees from coming into this country. Never mind that the Paris attacks were not perpetrated by Syrian Muslims. They were all radicalized Europeans. It was a classic case of scapegoating. And the rhetoric just got worse from there, and as I said, we have never recovered. And now this identity politics, in the ugliest possible sense, has just infected the political discourse in this country, although in a very polarized way. Because at the same time as you had these 31 governors and these 14 presidential candidates, most of whom happened to be Republicans, making those xenophobic, Islamophobic remarks, you had all three Democratic candidates saying the exact polar opposite, which was, at that time, it was President Obama was in office. They said President Obama is not bringing enough Syrian refugees into this country. He should bring in 65,000 more. And Hillary Clinton, Martin O'Malley, Bernie Sanders all said that. And this was shocking because The refugee program, as had been discussed during the last panel, was really a bipartisan program. For most of my career, we had as many Republican as we had Democratic supporters of the refugee resettlement program. As was mentioned, the 1980 Refugee Act passed nearly unanimously in the Senate. It passed unanimously in the Senate and nearly unanimously in the House of Representatives. But we're in a totally different place. It's a polarized country with otherization, vilification of the other, and we continue to be there today. And you hear it in the rhetoric of the current campaign, where one of the candidates is saying that they're animals, that the undocumented immigrants who are coming to this country are animals. And he said, some people may criticize me for saying that, but they're animals. So we're in the 1920s all over again, and I hope we don't repeat the same mistakes.
Yeah, let me just follow up from what Mark's saying. I think the point about the ugly discourse is really something that we need to think about. You know, if you take it back to the 1920s, so the context in which that Immigration Act was passed was a context in which we had just gone through the largest ugly, far-right, racist movement in American history, the Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s, which had somewhere above 1 million, 3 million, maybe 5 million members. You had to be white, native-born, and Protestant to be in the Klan. That was a fairly small segment of the population, and so a very large percentage of the eligible population joined the Klan. So one of the things, the ugly discourse is that there's a racial extremism in the country that sometimes gets tied up in the mainstream. So in the 1920s, the Klan was promoted by Protestant ministers, politicians. It intervened in the Democratic presidential nomination to oppose Al Smith as a Catholic. You know, and why did the Klan gain so much power then? Because they exploited the issue of immigration. So immigration of Catholics, immigration of Jews, and internal migration of African Americans from the south to the north. So immigration was racialized, was made a threat to white, Protestant, native-born power and, mobilized people. I think it's worth pointing out that the Klan, of course, supported cutting off immigration, but they also supported many horrific things toward people who were in this country already, right? So firing people from their jobs and cutting people off from benefits, all kinds of things. So the immigration isn't, when it becomes a powerful, racialized political vehicle, isn't only about stopping people from coming across the border. It is about attacking people who came across the border earlier. Then, you see that kind of racialized power, especially the tie of Jews to immigration, continue, from the 1920s till today. So you have this idea of replacement starts to take place, that it's not just that too many immigrants are coming and it maybe steps on the toes of white culture, it's that white people are being replaced. You start to see that discourse that comes to the U.S. out of France. It comes from the far right and leaches into the mainstream population. It becomes even more explicitly anti-Semitic in the 1970s when a person named David Lane, who's part of a right-wing terrorist group called The Order, which assassinated the Jewish talk show host Alan Berg in his driveway. He's the person who invented the 14 words, we shall ensure the existence of our race and the future of white children. And the idea that immigration it wasn't just that Jews were immigrating, but Jews were orchestrating the immigration of other people to replace whites. So that becomes the doctrine of white genocide, and that's a fairly short step from that concept that Jews are manipulating immigration to ruin the white race. Jews in the far right are considered not white, of course. It's a short step from that to what happened in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, and I'd like to continue on this topic for our next question, to maybe ask the question of why do we think that it has become prevalent among white supremacists and conspiratorial thinkers to connect anti-immigration sentiment to anti-Judaism, even though very few immigrants to the U.S. today are Jewish? And if we can also maybe speak to how the Pittsburgh synagogue attack was connected to Hias and to anti-immigration sentiment. Do you want to start this time?
Sure. I would say, for me, this really started with the Charlottesville rally and the white supremacists marching, chanting, "Jews will not replace us." And frankly, at that time, I didn't even know what that meant. Like, I had no familiarity with replacement theory. It wasn't anything that those of us at Hias thought about. But I'll never forget, it was on a weekend, but my staff called me immediately. They said, "We have to speak out against this." So we did at Charlotte's in the Charlottesville rally. But then it continued in the Tree of Life, in the shooting at the Tree of Life building. And in that case, the murderer, the mass murderer who killed the 11 Jews who were praying in the building, belonging to 3 different congregations, including one of which partners with Hias, Dor Hadash, as was mentioned, to celebrate Refugee Shabbat. The last thing he posted was, "Hias is bringing invaders to kill my people, screw the optics, I'm going in." And he killed 11 people as a result. And at that time, Hias, we thought of ourselves as being really an apple pie agency. Other Jewish organizations, of course, had very serious levels of security to get into their buildings. We didn't. I mean, we were always thinking, who would attack us? We just welcome refugees. We're just a refugee resettlement agency. That's not controversial. And it has literally become probably one of the most controversial things that any Jewish organization does right now. And so we have totally had to change our security profile. We've had to become really a very different agency. At that time, we were advertising for a international security director, but the emphasis there was on international, because we were more worried about Hias's operations in Kenya and Venezuela and Chad. We weren't even thinking that we would need a security director for our operations in the United States. But now we obviously, that's the focus. That's half of the focus of that. It's become not just a person, it's a whole department within Hias. One of, and I hate to even talk about this, but one of the things that the murderer posted also on social media was, "Thank you, Hias, for telling me where your friends are," before he went to the synagogue. Because obviously the whole point of Refugee Shabbat was to publicly celebrate how Jews welcome refugees to this country, because we were once refugees, and so we have natural empathy. But we can't do that anymore, right? It is now, the congregation wants to promote their engagement with refugees and with Hias. That is a decision we leave to the congregation. So that's how far we have fallen.
I'd like to add one thing. It's important to realize that what happened in Pittsburgh, what happened was not just the act of an extremist, but took place in a context in which that kind of extremism was being mainstreamed. So a few weeks before the shooting at the True Life Synagogue, then President Trump posted or retweeted on Twitter, a video that showed money being handed out to what would appear to be Spanish-speaking migrants to come into the country. And a congressman, who's still a congressman, Matt Gaetz, retweeted it with the additional information provided, according to him, that the money that was being given to migrants to come into this country was being given by George Soros. So that, George Soros, I'm sure most people know, is basically the far-right anti-Semitic figure of conspiracy that the Rothschilds were, decades before, a century before. But now, George Soros is the person both in Europe and the U.S. and the far right's pointed at. That really closes the circle. That is the replacement theory. It's not just that people are coming into the country, it's that they're being brought in by Jews for a specific reason, which is to undermine white race, white culture. So it's what the shooter was reading on Gab, was, the most horrendous kinds of anti-Semitic comments, but it's really important to realize they are being echoed, by, at that point, through the president's office and through the offices of the Congress people as well. And I think we're in a very dangerous position when sort of the mainstreaming of extremism, is so evident and is really quite based on a conspiratorial anti-Semitism.
If I can just add to the mainstreaming, this replacement theory really has become incredibly mainstream in political discourse. In fact, in one of the Republican debates this year, my son texted me. He said, "Dad, you're not going to believe this. Vivek Ramaswamy just endorsed replacement theory in the debate." And I said, "Oh, no, he didn't." But he did. He even did it by name. And, but of course they don't say Jews. He said progressives. But here you have somebody who isn't even white embracing replacement theory. And now we have some Jews who are in the right who are embracing replacement theory. There was a front page article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago about people who are targeting Hayas and our operations in Central America on the basis of replacement theory as well. So it's really becoming more and more prevalent, whereas, again, when it was in Charlottesville, I didn't even know what they meant by it.
This is, I think, an apt segue into our next question, which is how do these conspiracy theories impact contemporary policy? And also, Kathy, if you could speak to your sense of how it is affecting or may affect the current election cycle.
It's one of the reasons we have not had immigration reform since, real immigration reform since the 1980s. We haven't had any immigration reform since the 1990s. So it's having a really serious impact on our policies. And I would also say what concerns me as much as the impact it's having on our policies is the impact it's having on our political discourse, right? I could criticize a lot of the things that the Biden administration has done in immigration and refugees. I could talk about some good things as well. But one thing I do have to thank the Biden administration for is trying to change the discourse, at least early in the administration, against the foreign-born. Like, for example, one of the first things that President Biden did when he came into office was he barred the use of the word alien in the U.S. government. You are now to use the word non-citizen, even though alien is the word that is in the law, in the Immigration and Nationality Act. You know, he really made an effort to try to rehumanize the foreign-born, people who had been dehumanized by the previous administration and by so much of the political rhetoric of today. But frankly, he's not doing it nearly enough. Like, he's really got to pick up the pace on that because of the issues that we're talking about right now. The policy is important. There's no way any real policy work is going to get done in this political environment and in this Congress. There's no way we're going to get immigration reform this year. But we can at least work on not dehumanizing people, and that's something we all have a responsibility in, and it's something President Biden certainly has to use his bully pulpit.
I guess the other issue it's good to bring to the table is the issue of social media and the internet platforms, which are having, you know, a substantial role in allowing conspiracy theories to, you know, blossom in really quite unchecked ways. So the mainstreaming of extremism is through, you know, political figures, but it's also through social media. I wouldn't advise anyone to look at any of these what are now pretty much cesspools, but, you know, you look at X, you know, it used to be Twitter or Telegram, Gab, and they're all full of comments about immigrants, you know, they're anti-Semitic in the most vile ways that you could that are really imaginable. So, you know, that's a force that's now intertwined with all the political and issues we have, but it's also kind of an independent force that's really allowing the proliferation and reinforcement of these kind of conspiracy theories.
Yeah, and I would also add that sometimes I force myself to watch Fox. I'll put on Fox News with the volume off, but still, it's so disconcerting because maybe a majority of their coverage, it seems, is about crimes committed by the foreign-born. Like, it's almost constant, this barrage of information about all of these immigrants who are committing crimes and killing people here in the United States, when in reality, we all know that statistically, immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, commit crimes at a much lower rate than the native-born. I mean, that is a fact. But you wouldn't know it from watching Fox. You would think that there's a huge crime wave of violent crime hitting the country, hitting the entire country, and that it's because of immigration.
What might be some possible pathways for addressing the mainstreaming of extremism? Is there any way to inoculate people from absorbing these xenophobic or anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, or at the very least limit their circulation?
Yes, I think it's really important to realize there are ways to deal with this, because it can seem very overwhelming that there's no sort of, we're on a train that there's no stopping. But one thing I think is really important is we as a society have to stop the normalization of this. We have to now figure out a way to say it's not normal, it's not appropriate for our leaders to be spewing, you know, racist conspiracy theories. It's not appropriate for us as a society to have our children's online games infiltrated with Nazi propaganda. You know, we have crossed the line in the society so many times without sort of saying, this is not the way we want to live. So I think one of the things we need to do is figure out a way as individuals, as groups, as, you know, collectives to start, you know, saying, you know, portraying immigrants and talking about immigrants as animals and vermin is not normal. It's not the way people should live. I think, you know, one way is just really trying to make that decision. The other way is to start dealing with the problems we have. Almost everybody agrees social media is out of control. The platforms are allowing things on them and allowing things to circulate that shouldn't be there and that are reaching into our children and teenagers and in ways that are highly inappropriate. We have to now pressure to have something, some limits to those social media circulation, to what is basically driving the conversation of a lot of our children, at the moment. And, well, I'll stop there. I'll let Mark talk.
No, I agree. I mean, I would only add for emphasis that we can't. The worst thing that's happened over the last few years is we've gotten accustomed to this racist, hateful discourse, this dehumanizing discourse, and we don't speak up every time we hear it anymore because it's just become background noise in a way, and that is really unacceptable. I mean, what I said about the Johnson-Reed Act when I was interviewed by the JTA the other day was, right, we have to remember that the Johnson-Reed Act was a product of the 20s, and the 20s was followed by the 30s and the 40s. And we have to make sure we reverse this deterioration of the way that we talk about one another and the way that we talk about the other before it just goes too far, and it may have already.
Great. So now's the time in our session where I remind people, I know I've been getting some questions, but I want to remind everyone to please, if you have a question, write it down on the cards and send it to us. Yeah, and the last question I'm going to give you from what we've discussed is directed at Mark. As an advocate and a leader in the area of immigration, what would you say to the American Jewish community about why they should be concerned about immigration today? And what are some ways that people might, American Jews or others, might get involved in this issue as supporters and advocates?
Yeah, that gets me to a slightly more optimistic note. I'm depressing myself with this panel up here right now. So let's try to reverse that. Sorry, let's cheer you up. When I became the CEO of HIAS in 2013, my biggest problem was apathy, like apathy within the Jewish community and apathy within the larger community on refugee issues in particular. That's not even in my top 50 list right now as a problem. Nobody is apathetic about that issue anymore. But maybe we don't speak out enough, and we all do have voices, and we have to use that, and that itself can have an impact. We have to shame people for dehumanizing refugees, for dehumanizing immigrants, for dehumanizing other human beings. We have to speak out, and we have the power to do something about that. And that has to be our focus. We're not going to have comprehensive immigration reform, as I said, but we do have the power to hold our leaders responsible. We have to make sure the Democrats don't try to match the Republicans in terms of stoking fear of immigrants because it's politically convenient. We have to make sure that they speak out against this abhorrent rhetoric, and we can do that.
Thank you. So we have some really interesting questions here. The first one is just asking you to go a little bit deeper into the history and even etymology of replacement theory, where this discourse comes from, if it has echoes in the protocols of the Elders of Zion, anything you could kind of tell our audience about. We have obviously this really destructive conspiracy theory. Can we talk about where it might come from at all?
Yeah, so briefly, it really took its modern form in France in the 1970s through a series of books, including one that was really influential called Camp of the Saints. And it was basically about Islamic immigrants coming from Africa and ruining Western civilization in Europe. That's basically the theme of it. And that became quite popularized in France, across the continent, and that's really the origin of modern replacement theory. But that started out with this idea of sort of numerical replacement, like there were going to be a large number of immigrants from Muslim countries relative to the population of France. So it wasn't initially fully an anti-Semitic trope, but it became more anti-Semitic over time, and it became more anti-Semitic when it came to the U.S. and kind of merged with anti-Semitic ideas in the U.S. The U.S. sort of history of replacement theory, it starts out more of a miscegenation, like Jews and other races are going to destroy the white race by, marrying them or having sex with women who are white, of the white race and so forth. Then replacement theory starts to be tied up to this idea that there's a numerical shift in the population, and the number of whites relative to the combined total of all people who are at least by racist measures not white is, the balance is changing, and will soon be a non-white country. That gets picked up and tied into then a sense of intentionality, like why are we becoming non-white? How's that happening? So why are these immigrants coming? And then the final step is because there's an intentionality, there's a group doing it. It's not happening by chance. So first it's like Jews are in a global elite, and they're bringing non-whites to this country sort of for their own capitalist means. And then it becomes, with David Lane, even more viciously anti-Semitic, with the turn to saying, Jews are doing this intentionally to destroy the non-Jewish white race. And so that's sort of the turn. And it gets more and more tied closely to Jews as the perpetrator, and more tied to this sense of a conflict between whites and Jews in which one side is going to be destroyed. And that's, really the definition of the most destructive kind of anti-Semitism that, of course, you see, in World War II, other times.
Thank you. And now, because we like to continue depressing all of you, I'm gonna, this next set of questions I got are really all about immigration policy today and HIAS's work today. So there's a number of questions here about what HIAS's work and strategies are considering immigration policy today. And if you could tell us a little bit about what HIAS is facing in terms of policy right now. And also, if you could tell us a little bit about how the current crisis in the Middle East may be impacting HIAS's work.
Sure. And I'll say, first of all, that, and this was interestingly discussed in the last panel, so I can build on that. But for many years, HIAS was primarily a refugee resettlement agency, meaning we took people from their country of origin or their country of first asylum and brought them to a new country. And if they made the choice to go to Israel and make Aliyah, that would be done by the Jewish agency, by the Sachnut, or if they decided to go somewhere else, like the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, HIAS would help them make that move. And so when we were helping Jews since 1948, since the establishment of the State of Israel, the conversation was always about resettlement. Where do you want to go? The problem is most refugees, and there are many of them right now, right? There are more displaced persons in the world than there have been at any time in human history at this moment. When we started helping non-Jews in more significant numbers, and now of course that's overwhelmingly what we do at Highest, helping people not because they're Jewish but because we are, they don't have that choice. They just have to go to the first country that they can flee to. It is very hard to find a country that will accept you. So Highest had to change the nature of our work. We had to start working with refugees to make them safe where they are, where they managed to flee to, because we can't usually get them to another country. So we help them with economic integration. We help that so they can support themselves. We help them with legal protection to make sure they're not sent back to a dangerous place, and that they get the documents that they need to protect themselves within their country of first asylum. We help them with mental health and psychosocial care so that they can survive and thrive in their country of first asylum. And then if we can't get that done, then we have to pursue resettlement and try to bring them to another country, which again has been very, very difficult. In the United States, the Trump administration pretty much eviscerated the U.S. resettlement program, right? So when President Trump took office in 2017, the refugee ceiling had been set by President Obama to bring in 110,000 refugees a year under the Refugee Act of 1980. By the time he left office, Trump had brought that down to an all-time low number of 15,000. So from 110,000 to 15,000 refugees a year. And so the Biden administration tried really hard to build that back up, and then Afghanistan collapsed, and they brought 80-some thousand Afghans here over a very short period of time, and we didn't have the capacity anymore to resettle that number because of the domestic system to resettle people had been so eviscerated, we and the other 9 resettlement agencies. So we had to work with the administration to get creative and find ways to resettle people and to build up that capacity very quickly. So we launched, we being Highest, but also the U.S. government, the concept of private resettlement based on the Canadian model. So now, normally Highest resettles refugees in places where we have a Jewish Family Service Agency as a partner. Now we can resettle refugees anywhere where we have a group of people that wants to help welcome a refugee into their community. So we're very excited about that. We're very focused on private resettlement, private sponsorship, working through the Welcome Corps. We're actually doing the same thing in Europe right now. So that's an exciting way to get involved. There's a lot of enthusiasm for that. Across the Jewish community, which we're really proud of. So there are new opportunities to engage. And of course, advocacy is going to be more and more important as well for the reasons that we've been talking about all afternoon. And then in terms of the part 2 of your question.
Not my question, it's their question.
Part 2 of your question. October 7th and post-October 7th has been one of the most difficult things that we've had to deal with, which I think is true for many people who work in the Jewish community, and especially people who work about the Jewish community and the humanitarian community. We responded immediately. We do operate in Israel and have operated in Israel since before there was a state, a Jewish state, and we gave cash-based assistance and mental health psychosocial services to the many Israelis who were displaced, but also to the asylum seekers in Israel from Eritrea and Sudan who were really falling between the cracks. Those are our traditional clientele now in Israel. So giving them assistance as well. We are heartbroken by what's going on in Gaza right now, by the impending famine. And we are doing our best to speak out, to urge humanitarian action, to make sure that people can get food and that humanitarian workers and civilians are protected in a way that they obviously have not been. So it's heartbreaking for us as a humanitarian agency to have to witness this, but we can't do so silently.
Great. Thank you. And now I am really going to leave it to the both of you to think of any last messages that you want to close out this panel with, this last panel of today's really excellent symposium.
Yeah, I think it's important, despite, everything that's been said here, to realize that, the situation we're in right now is not inevitable and it's not unchangeable, right? We've gone through some periods of U.S. history, where racism and antisemitism has really taken hold in terrible ways. And people turn that around. So I think it's really important not to be completely fatalistic about this. We have votes, we have voices, as Mark was saying, not seeing this as inevitable, not seeing this as normal, and, figuring out a way to respond to this is urgent, but it's also something that can work.
And the note of optimism I'll end on, this is the one thing that gives me hope, or one of the things that gives me hope. Maybe there are two things. One has been the response of the Jewish community. Like, I really am proud of the way, since the refugee crisis and the body of Aylan Kurdi, the little Syrian boy who washed up on the shores of Turkey when he drowned trying to get with his family to Greece. It really woke up. He really woke up the American Jewish community and many communities of faith. And I'm proud of the way that Jews all over the country, and frankly, in many parts of the world, has risen to the occasion and really engaged in trying to find solutions for refugees and being a partner of refugees in a way that we as a community hadn't been for a while since the Soviet Jewry movement. So that makes me proud and gives me hope. And I will say I was on a panel with somebody from the evangelical community, and that person said he wished that he could have said the same about his community, and so we have to work on them. The second thing I want to say that gives me hope is that sometimes the facts matter, and they happen to be on our side in this, right? Because refugees and immigrants have been vilified since the founding of this country, right? Even though we had interesting conversations this morning about the myth of our being a nation of immigrants, whereas our real history is far more complicated than that. But one thing that isn't complicated is that since the Alien and Sedition Act of the Adams administration, refugees and immigrants have been vilified and been under suspicion. But in the end of the day, when you look at the facts over 250 years of history, they have always been givers. They have always contributed to our economy and to our culture and put this country in a better and a stronger place. I mean, that is the thing, is that refugees are a blessing to this country. They're not a burden. I mean, they're a burden for a little while, but it is an investment that has consistently paid off, even though they're always viewed as security threats. When you look at history, can you name one incident where refugees who were admitted actually presented a security threat to this country? And I can't. They've enriched this country, and the last thing I'll say is the Trump administration, in the Muslim and refugee ban that was issued on International Holocaust Remembrance Day in 2017, one of the provisions of that executive order was President Trump ordered that there be a study on how much refugees cost the United States, what a burden they are. And luckily, the smart people at the Department of Health and Human Services says, well, if we do a study on the costs, we also have to look at the benefits. We have to look at both sides of the ledger. And they found that resettled refugees over a 10-year period contributed $63 billion more in taxes at the state, local, and federal level than they took in services and benefits. So it was just, so that, needless to say, that study was never released. It was suppressed. But you can find it on the Washington Post webpage because they got a draft of it. And the Biden administration, we just met with Secretary of HHS Xavier Becerra a couple of weeks ago. They decided to update that study because they thought it was one of the better ideas in the Trump administration. So they looked at a 15-year period of time, and they found that resettled refugees actually contributed a multiple of that over a period of 15 years to this country. So facts are on our side. Refugees are good for this country. They're good for the economy. We can't fill jobs fast enough when we bring refugees into this country. That is no longer a challenge, and so we have to raise this up. Thank you.